So I think there is a deep conflict between the way the revealed religions describe God and the way something like Neoplatonism describes God.
We have these intuitions. I mean, even scripture talks about it. Even rationally demands it. Then how can on all these three levels, if that doctrine is being refuted, how can someone still actually adhere to it? Like I think sometimes.
One person says God's like Swiss cheese and we're the holes in God. Sometimes people say like some interesting things.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I was not expecting this conversation to be funny also, all right? Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today, again, we have a power-packed episode for you guys because today's guest is renowned. He's a well-known theologian and a philosopher. I'm actually delighted to host Dr. Rand Mullins, a scholar of deep rigor and bold imagination. Dr. Mullins holds a PhD in philosophical theology from University of St. Andrews. He also completed further advanced research work in theology at the University of Helsinki, and currently he serves as a lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Lucerne. Over the years, Dr. Mullins has published many essays and several influential work on God, emotion, time, and challenges to divine simplicity. I think he's one of the most passionate people who is against divine simplicity. His work has shaped major conversations in contemporary philosophical theology, so it's my honor to invite him on stage. Dr. Mullins, welcome to Incisive Thoughts. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me.
So tonight's discussion, I think, is gonna be very pressing because there's a lot of theology here. Maybe my audience are not well versed with these kind of topics, but I think it is important that these things also should be addressed. So before we dwell into it, I want to start light and ask you, what is your favorite, which argument for God's existence do you find to be the strongest and the most pressing?
So the cosmological argument from contingency, that's the one I find I always come back to. Yeah.
Okay. So can you very, very briefly address what that exactly is? Maybe we can that can help us to segue into the topic that we are going to get into.
Yeah, sure. So the idea is that there's some kind of principle of rationality that's fundamental to reality, that everything needs an explanation. And explanations, they typically bottom out at necessity, like something that has to exist. And so when we're trying to explain all of this stuff around us that does not have to exist, we need an explanation in terms of something that does have to exist. And a natural, like a very intuitive hypothesis is that God is that necessarily existent thing that could explain everything else. That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that sounds great. Now, before we get into these kind of philosophical hair splittings, I just want to have one thing you address for me, which is theology, which we are going to dwell into, is that just pointless speculation?
I mean, maybe it is. Who knows? I don't think it's pointless because we speculate about everything all the time. We can't help but try to make sense of the world around us. It's just part of human nature. And I think that instinct, that urge within human nature to try to make sense of reality, I think it's pointing towards something that's actually there out in the world. We're always trying to make sense of our psychology, trying to make sense of like scientific explanations of the universe. And there's this drive to come up with an ultimate explanation of reality. So I think what our minds are doing are tracking these rational principles. So this urge within us is perfectly rational. So the sort of speculation that takes place in theology, I think there's a rationality behind it.
Okay. And one thing I really found very interesting what you address is that even if theology is speculation, you divide it into two types of speculation. One is grounded speculation and one is wild speculation. If you can address that, what that is.
Yeah. So grounded speculation is when you're kind of theorizing based off some stuff you know to be true. Whereas wild speculation is when you're not really working from anything that you know to be true. Like you're just kind of like just throwing stuff out there. So a grounded speculation might be something like this. Like we know that the universe has not always existed. It's existed for about 13.5 billion years, give or take a billion years. And so now we're like, well, things that begin to exist, well, they have a cause. I mean, like everything we've seen that's that has a beginning, we know it has a cause. So we're like, okay, well, our universe began to exist. So what caused it? And so we're speculating based on some things we know to be true, based on like the actual experiences we're having. So that's grounded.
Okay, so I hope that our conversation stays on grounded theology tonight.
We'll see.
Yeah, so what we are going to do in the discussion is, now as you provided one argument for God's existence, which is quite robust. We have some idea that there has to be a God. Now, there are different models in theology to explain what that God might be. There is theism, classical theism, divine simplicity, which is within classical theism. So I want you to first briefly explain these different models, probably. What is classical theism? What is neoclassical theism? If you can do that.
Mm-hmm. So there's this basic fundamental concept of God that everyone is assuming in these debates. And so whatever it is to be God is to be perfect and to be the single ultimate foundation of reality. So that's the basic underlying concept that everybody's trying to grab. When you're developing a model of God, you are giving some unique articulation of what it means to be perfect and then what it means to be the foundation of reality. So most of the models of God think that God's like all powerful, all knowing, perfectly good, perfectly free, things like that. So what I was saying is, so these all these different models of God, they all agree on things like omnipotence, necessary existence, that God's eternal, that God's all knowing, this kind of stuff. But there's disagreements, and where the disagreements come into play, that's where you start seeing these unique models of God. So classical theism says that there's 4 unique attributes that the other models supposedly don't have, and then that God creates the universe out of nothing. So that's the way they articulate how God is the foundation of reality. So the 4 unique attributes are supposed to be timelessness, immutability, impassibility, and simplicity. And I can say more about those in a minute. Neoclassical theism agrees that God creates the universe out of nothing. It's like they're like, that sounds good to us. And then they reject one or more of those unique attributes. So some people will go, I don't like simplicity, but I do like timelessness. Others will go, impassibility, that's ridiculous, get rid of it. And then others will just say, no, get rid of all 4 of those unique attributes. Open theism affirms creation out of nothing. So that's the story of how God is the ultimate foundation of reality. But open theism denies all 4 of those classical attributes. And then they make this other claim that God created an open universe. So God created a universe where there is no future. There's no settled timeline about how exactly history will unfold. So God does not have exhaustive foreknowledge. God knows all there is to know, but there's no facts about the future to know, sort of. That's kind of the idea. There's 2 more models left that are very popular across the world, like throughout history. So the next one is Pantheism. So Pantheism says that God and the universe are identical. So you're not creating the universe out of nothing like that. The universe is just is God somehow. Either we're like modes of God, or we're just ideas in the mind of God. One person says God's like Swiss cheese and we're the holes in God. Sometimes people say like some interesting things. And then there's Panentheism. So this is the final one. Panentheism says it's not like classical or neoclassical open theism, and it's not pantheism. It's something in the middle. And you're like, well, what is that? I don't know, and I've written like 4 or 5 papers on this, and I'm like, what are you guys talking about? Because they like to take metaphors from other people and then claim them as their own and think that's something interesting. The best I can say is this: they reject creation out of nothing. Like, that's a very consistent theme. And they think that God always exists with a universe of some sort. So either God's eternally creating a universe, or a series of universes, or a multiverse, or all of the cosmic stuff just necessarily emanates from God. These are kind of claims you'll see from panentheists.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that was like 5 models that you provided, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
and we can deal with all of them. One would be our primary focus for this discussion, which is classical theism. And I think classical theism, at least from Christian theology perspective, I think it has gained a lot of popularity. From an Islamic stance, I think from the major Sunni group, they always rejected aspects, at least one aspect of classical theism, which is divine simplicity, which we in our tradition find it really problematic. Actually, we consider that if you accept divine simplicity, you're outside the folds of the Sunni consensus. So what is within classical theism? You mentioned four different attributes that are ascribed in some sense. One is divine simplicity. So what that is, can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. Also, I'm really glad you point out that this has been a very controversial attribute within your traditions, because a lot of times when I try to tell a Christian academics this, I'm like, this has been the minority position within a lot of Islamic traditions. They're like, no, everyone always affirms something. I'm like, no, there's this thing called history. Please learn it. And so that's an ongoing fight. But yeah, so here's one articulation that you see quite early on. And the claim is that God has no properties, no attributes, no tropes, no forms, nothing of the sort. And whereas the attributionist view says, no, God has attributes. What are you guys doing with this simplicity stuff? So that's like the earliest claim, but there's something underlying it, which is that there's no complexity, no diversity, no distinctions of any sort in God. And then depending on whichever ontology or metaphysical system you have, that's going to articulate a bunch of different distinctions or kinds of complexity you might have. And if you've got simplicity, then you're going to go, well, let's get rid of that. So the distinction between substance and properties or attributes. Well, if you've got that in your metaphysical system and you think God's simple, then you got to say God doesn't have those distinctions. Like, if you've got act and potency, you think that things have potential and then they actualize that potential. Well, that's a distinction. Okay, well, that doesn't apply to the simple God either. And on you go. So sometimes you'll see these claims like, well, all of God's, like when I say God is all powerful, when I say God is all wise or all loving, or, insert whatever attribute you want. What I really mean is God is identical to all of that, because he doesn't have any properties, doesn't actually have attributes, but he's somehow identical to these attributes. All these actions that we talk about God having, God created the universe, God was listening to your prayers last night. Those are all identical somehow to each other, and such that God only has one action that he does, and that one action is identical to his necessary existence. So any sort of distinction you got in your head, you got to get rid of it because it doesn't apply to God.
Right. So I think one of the most problematic things that I comes to my mind directly when I hear divine simplicity is, do you mean to say that God's love and God's wrath are the same thing? Is that a critique of it? Because that it would imply that it's the same thing.
Right. It is. Because so I've got in my first book, The End of the Timeless God, I've got this nice quote from this 1600s English theologian. I think it's Henry Church is his name. And he's like, the love and hatred of God are the same thing. And you're like, how does that work? Because these seem like very different emotions, very different sentiments. And saying that God has wrath is really controversial in the Christian tradition, at least. Everybody says he has it, but then when you start poking, like, do you really mean that? They're like, well, maybe like metaphorically. Okay, maybe not really. When I say God has wrath, what I mean is God loves you. And if you're a sinner, you experience that love as this really terrible, awful thing. And I'm like, I don't think that's what wrath is, because typically when you say wrath or anger, you've got an object. I'm angry at you. Why? Because you did certain things, and it's not a pleasant feeling. It's a negative feeling. And if you're like, well, God just loves you, and he's just happy all the time, because that's what impassibility says. But you just experience God's like perfect happiness as like this dreadful, awful thing. I find that implausible.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about what might be the motivation to actually even put forward such a doctrine like divine simplicity. Is it because the argument that you spoke about in the initial part of our conversation was contingency argument. So is that having a hardcore stance on that argument, or some particular principle applied on that argument leads to divine simplicity? Is that the case?
I don't think it is. So what I was relying on is just a version of the principle of sufficient reason, that there's an explanation for everything. Or you could have a weaker one, which is contingent things need an explanation, because necessary things, they don't need an explanation, because that's where explanation bottoms out. So, whichever version you want, doesn't matter. None of those get you to divine simplicity. So when you're looking at someone, for example, like Samuel Clarke, he was a big proponent of the argument from contingency, and he thinks simplicity is false. He thinks it's just the unintelligible notions of the schoolmen, of all the scholastics. So you definitely don't need it. Richard Swinburne, he and William Lane Craig, Josh Rasmussen, Timothy O'Connor, all of these people, they have promoted this argument from contingency, and they reject simplicity. So you definitely don't need it. So a lot of natural theology gets done without needing simplicity. Typically, what's going on is when people are giving arguments for simplicity, if they're looking at something like a cosmological argument, they're introducing a few extra principles. So one principle is any sort of distinction needs an explanation. And I'm like, okay, well, how about the fact that they're just distinct? Like love and wrath they're just not the same thing. Because that's just what love and wrath are. And you're like, well, it needs to be explained. I'm like, well, it is explained, like by itself. Like there's no more explanation. Well, like, well, where does that complexity come from? And I'm like, it's just part of the nature of things. So they're like, I feel like they're asking for something like that where there's no answer to be given. So sometimes they'll introduce another principle, which is any composition, not complexity, but composition. So parts and wholes. Anything that is composite needs to be composed by some third thing, something outside of itself. So if God had the property, so say God creates a universe, and then he gets the property being the creator. Well, God's composed of himself and this property, and so something outside of God has to like make God be composed in this way. And I'm like, I don't understand how we got here. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And also, the more deeper and more fundamental point is, why on earth should I think that just having properties is composition? Why should I think that these are parts, like literal parts? Metaphorically parts, sure, but like literally parts? I don't know. And I've not seen a compelling argument for that. Usually it's just an assumption that any kind of like distinction you identify, that just counts as a part. And I'm like, that's a really permissive view of parts.
Right. And I think this is where I think their primary argument against at the attributionist view is probably because they think that no, any kind of composition would entail this kind of a thing. So they are scared of compositions. But I think you have highlighted quite brilliantly how in mereology, which is the study of part and whole relationships, you've highlighted that not everything is like, everything that can be considered as a part. A part is something that comes apart. So is that correct? That is what you imply. So if
That's
we
what
take
I
that
think.
definition of part, it does not apply on God's attributes, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I actually want to go a bit stronger. I think it needs to be a substantial thing. So like any substances that can come apart from each other, that's what counts as a part. So when I'm looking at like the desk that I'm sitting at right now, it's got a bunch of substantial parts, and they can come apart. Whereas when I'm talking about an immaterial being, like a soul, for example, like St. Augustine, for example. So St. Augustine affirms divine simplicity, but he also affirms the simplicity of the soul. And he doesn't think that, and he thinks the soul has different powers, different faculties, and these are all distinct like properties or attributes of the soul. And Augustine doesn't think those are literal parts. And so I'm like, so if these aren't parts, then when we come to God, why all of a sudden are these parts? Like what's going on here? So I don't think there's a lot of consistency at play, because the intuition I think is there that a soul is not made up of parts. Like, come on. So I think there's like some clashes here with consistency.
Yeah, and I think this is also a very interesting debate within the Muslim intellectual tradition as well, where, for example, Ibn Sina, constructed this kind of particular contingency argument, and then that argument entailed divine simplicity. Whereas if Ibn Taymiyyah later on came in and pointed out the flaw within it, and he also, I think, defined part in something that is attachable or detachable, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the flaw. So he reconstructed that argument. So the argument still can be robustly made, but that assumption that was there, that is problematic. And if you remove that, then the divine simplicity is never necessitated, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Al-Ghazali made the same point, going like, I don't need a lot of this stuff to get to like a necessarily existent being. Like I can do this argument without a lot of these principles. And then Keith Yandel, in his introduction to the philosophy of religion, he looks at like Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways for the existence of God. And Aquinas, as you probably know, is inspired by Ibn Sina in a lot of different respects. And when it comes to simplicity, there's a lot of influence there. And so Keith Yandel, when he's looking at Aquinas's 5 ways, he's like, these aren't sound. Some of them are not valid. But here's a way you can fix up these arguments for the existence of God. And you don't need anything like a bunch of these principles that lead to simplicity or timelessness or this or that. You can get along just fine without them.
Right. So that reminds me of Edward Fesser, who actually has a very strong stance on divine simplicity. He says something like it's only classical theism or nothing, something like that. And you highlight that. Can you address that?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah. It's classical theism or atheism is what he says. It is.
Yes. How would you address that?
Well, I just think there's no argument there. Like there's no cogent argument that I can find, because we've got a long history of a lot of people doing natural theology, all without getting anywhere near divine simplicity. And Fesser, in one of his papers, he makes this claim that divine ultimacy is a unique methodological constraint that you only find in classical theism. And I'm like, well, Tim O'Connor's book, Tim O'Connor's an open theist. Tim O'Connor's book is called Theism and Ultimate Explanations. It's in the title. So does he not take ultimacy to be like a constraint on God? William Lane Craig makes a big deal about ultimacy being a constraint on God. Jonathan Quanvig does. Brian Leftow's massive book, God and Necessity, like it's like, I think it's on like page 2, where he's like, yeah, ultimacy is pretty important for how we like a constraint for how we theorize about God. And all of those people say divine simplicity is false. So I think Fesser is just mischaracterizing everybody who he disagrees with in a very, very profound way.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And I was not expecting this conversation to be funny also, right? I'm finding some bits very funny. So next thing that comes in is I want to ask you personally, what do you find the most implausible aspect of divine simplicity?
There's 2 actually. Like there's one that I just kind of set aside, but that hardly anybody can get over. Just this claim that God has no properties at all. Because it's a very standard principle in metaphysics. Like just any introduction to metaphysics usually has, this claim that every substance has a property, because every substance has something that kind of characterizes it to make it the kind of thing that it is. There's no bare substances. And so E.J. Lowe was Catholic. He's this great metaphysician. He died 2017, I think. I can't, or maybe it was a bit earlier than that. Yeah, I think it was earlier than that. And he was just this brilliant metaphysician. And he was like, yeah, everything that exists has, like every substance that exists has some properties. Well, I guess this means that divine simplicity is false, but that's beyond my pay grade. So I'm just going to keep moving on. So he just says it and moves on. And what I find that interesting, because it's just this, someone who's just trying to do good metaphysics and just going, that's just implausible. Like everything has to have a property. Like, come on. And E.J. Lowe is someone who develops an ontological argument for the existence of God, all without simplicity, all without timelessness. You're like, okay. So anyway, so that's the first implausibility, is just going, things have to have properties. What do you mean? The biggest implausibility for me, though, the one that I focused on a lot, is when you're trying to reconcile simplicity with a whole host of claims that all the different revealed religions like to talk about. So if you think that God created the universe out of nothing, for example, and that God was free to create or not create. These are important themes within a lot of the Abrahamic faiths. I don't know how you could possibly square that with divine simplicity. And there's a network of problems. I don't know which one you want to get into first, but there's a network of problems in this area.
Yeah, so I want to tackle all the interesting ones one by one. So one thing I think what divine simplicity entails, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you can't actually give God will, that God cannot even have a will of his own. Can you expand on that?
Okay, so I don't think there's a meaningful sense in which God has a will, but proponents of simplicity will say God's will is identical to his essence and existence. So you'll find some people who will go, he doesn't actually have a will. But a lot of them will also go, no, it's identical. And here is why it's difficult to make sense of that, because a will can be used in two different ways, at least. A will could mean like you've got this power, this ability to perform an intentional action. An intentional action is something you intend to do. You wanted to do it. You were trying to do it. That's why it's called an intentional action. So a will is just your ability to perform intentional actions. Another sense of will is the actual action itself. Like I willed that this be done. So earlier, I had to wake my cat up and like give him food, and so I willed that action. So it was actually the actual doing of the action. And if you affirm simplicity, you've got to say both of these senses of will are identical to each other and identical to God. And I'm like, well, having the power and exercising the power, those are distinct concepts. They can't be identical. And like, well, they got to be identical in God. There's no untapped potential in God. There's no unactualized potential in God. And I'm like, okay, well then what would it mean? Like God just, here's the claim. So from all eternity, God's just there, just performing every single possible action. There's never like a moment where God's not performing all of these actions. There's never a moment where God's thinking like, do I want to do this or not? It's just from all eternity, God just is performing all actions that he does. He's just doing whatever he's doing timelessly. And somehow this is all identical to him. And I find it very confusing of how you're going to say God intended to do anything.
Yeah. And then another connected to this is also that divine simplicity may lead to a modal collapse. What that is, if you can expand.
So modality applies to different concepts like what's possible, what's actual, what's necessary, what's contingent. So you and I talking right now, I want to say that's contingent. It didn't have to be that way. So it's a contingent state of affairs. 2 + 2 = 4. That's a necessary truth. Like that had to be that way. It couldn't be any other. And when we say that God necessarily exists, we mean like God has to exist. He cannot fail to exist. Whereas you and I, we contingently exist. We don't have to exist. So a modal collapse is when all of these different distinct categories of necessity and contingency, possibility, actuality, a modal collapse is when all of those categories get collapsed into just one category. So you might say everything's contingent. There's no necessity in the world. And you're like, isn't that necessarily true that everything's contingent? Because then we've got necessity. Oh gosh. So that's incoherent. You could say everything's necessary, but there's no contingency in the world. And so that's what a modal collapse that I've focused on in some of my arguments is saying simplicity entails that everything is necessary. There's no contingency in the world.
Yeah. So that's what initially. Yeah. So initially the argument that we built on God's existence itself collapses. Is that the case?
Kind of. So you've got God necessarily existing, and whatever actions God performs, those have to be identical to his existence. So his act of listening to your prayers last night, that has to be identical to his existence. Well, anything identical to necessary existence is going to have the same modal status. It's going to have to be necessary as well. So it was absolutely necessary that God listened to your prayer last night. It's absolutely necessary that God sustained you in existence. Absolutely necessary that God listened to your prayer. Absolutely necessary that God created this universe. Everything that's happened, it's all absolutely necessary. So God was not free to do anything else. And you and I, it's not logically possible for us to do anything else because it's all absolutely necessary. The electron that's floating next to your left elbow, could it be slightly closer to your elbow or slightly further away? No, it is not logically possible because it's absolutely necessary, like where it is.
Wow.
It's a
That's
really wild claim. Yeah, it's a very wild claim. A
yeah.
lot of people just look at it and go, "No, I'm out. I can't possibly buy into this." It's highly counterintuitive.
So one thing comes to my mind is so one possible escape, probably, I don't know if it's possible or not, is people sometimes also move to something like Neoplatonism, what that is, and how would you critique that?
Mm-hmm. So Neoplatonism, it's this movement that you see a lot with people like Plotinus, and so what Plotinus does is he's got this sort of emanationist view of reality. So there's this thing called the One, which is like the ultimate foundation of reality, and the One mightily produces by doing absolutely nothing. Which I wasn't aware that you could mightily produce anything by doing nothing, but let's stick with Plotinus for a second longer.
Hmm.
So by doing absolutely nothing, the One produces this thing called the nous, or the mind. And the mind has all these ideas about all the possibilities. And the mind is like, man, I'm so awesome. And the One is even more awesome. And that's it. That's all that's really going on. And the mind does absolutely nothing other than think about itself and think about the One. And somehow by doing only those two things, it produces, without any intention to do so, it produces the world's soul. And the world's soul is this thing that looks at the divine mind and all the possibilities and goes, man, that's really cool. I want to make all of those things like real. All those ideas, I want to make those real. And so Plotinus gives us this story where the world soul was timeless, but then the world soul gives up timelessness in order to become temporal to create the universe. But then he also says the universe is eternal, so the universe has always existed. So there was no before the universe. And Plotinus makes a big deal about how there's no before the universe. But then I'm like, you also made a big deal about how the world soul was timeless before the universe and without the universe, but the universe was always there. So which is it? Like, is the universe always there or was it not? Like, what are you talking about, man? So the story gets really confusing really fast, but it was a very influential story throughout Western history. And one of the things that's interesting for our purposes is, let's go back to that One, the One that's the foundation of reality. So a lot of weird things pop up, like questions that we've been asking about. What Plotinus does is says the One is completely ineffable, indescribable. You can't talk about it at all. Except for the next 20 pages, I'm going to tell you exactly what the One is like. And you're like, so you're describing this indescribable thing quite well. That's interesting. But that's the move you see in a lot of these discussions is they'll talk in great detail about what God is like. And then when you push them on this, they'll go, we can't actually say anything about God. God's unknowable, indescribable. And then if you back off and go, okay, fine, objection withdrawn, then they'll go right back to describing what God is like. I've experienced this millions of times. I mean, this is just a very common feature in theology, not just with Neoplatonism, but just all across the board.
Wow. So one of the most implausible aspect of Neoplatonism, what would that be for you? Like,
For me,
why do you reject that?
I think it's the ineffability. So Plotinus is saying, I'm going to give you an ultimate explanation of reality. And here's my hypothesis. I'm like, okay, cool. Tell me more. But if your hypothesis for explaining reality is ineffable, that means it literally has no content. You can't have content. And so what it should be is like, hey, Khalid, I've got an ultimate explanation for reality. And you're like, what is it, Ryan? And I'm like, I can't tell you. There's no, like, it's indescribable. But trust me, like it's gonna explains everything. You have to have enough content in the hypothesis to actually explain stuff, to see if this is a possible explanation. And Plotinus cannot consistently give us content because it's supposed to be completely indescribable.
Right. And I think some people have picked on that idea, and some particular doctrines, like, within some religions actually take that and, attach it with their religion. But I think that doctrine itself, it's a bit problematic. I think within the Islamic tradition, there's one particular deviant group. I think the Ismailis, they incorporated Neoplatonism and try to incorporate that in Islam. But I think, like, purely from a scriptural perspective also, it makes no sense. Divine simplicity or Neoplatonism. I think for the Christian and for the Muslim scriptures, like Islam scriptures, they don't fit in, right? Scriptures don't allow for something like divine simplicity or Neoplatonism. What do you have to say about that?
I think this is right, and it doesn't apply just to our two religions. Like, so Ramanuja in the Hindu tradition, he's got this long. It's long. It's really long. He's going through all the different like Hindu scriptures, like the different Vedas and whatnot, and arguing there's these distinct attributes everywhere, and we can't meaningfully talk about God without assuming distinct attributes. So simplicity has to be false. And so there's a couple things going on here. One of them is the intuition that if God's revealed himself to us, then God has actually made something about himself known. So it is possible for us to know a little something about God. How much can we know about God? I have no clue, but we can at least know a little something. And then when we're looking at that revelation, what it tells us is there's just are these distinctions, these distinct attributes that are being attributed to God consistently. Like it's constant. And you don't see anywhere in the scriptures where it's like, oh yeah, all of my attributes are identical to each other. I have no potential. I don't actually have any properties whatsoever. I definitely don't have any accidental properties like being the creator or being the Lord or being the judge of all men. I don't have anything like that. You don't see that in the revealed religions. You don't see those claims. So I think there is a deep conflict between the way the revealed religions describe God and the way something like Neoplatonism describes God.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to stick to classical theism and neoclassical theism, but that discussion would be very would be a bit time consuming. So maybe for a change for our audience, maybe we can skip to something like pantheism. And why do you not accept pantheism? What is your strongest critique for it?
Yeah, so I originally thought pantheism was quite easy to grasp. God and the universe are identical. But I'm writing a book right now called Models of God and the Problems of Creation. And so I'm trying to look at all the different models of God and see how they answer the questions like, why would God create anything at all? Why would God create this particular universe? And then there's a bunch of like weird stuff that comes up along the way. And when it came to my chapter on pantheism, as I'm writing it, I realized there's no agreed upon way of articulating it. And I didn't fully appreciate that in my past publications. So Andrei Bukharev, in his book on pantheism, he makes this point quite strongly, going, the metaphysics of pantheism has never been really worked out. And so we need to do that. So you've got someone like Spinoza who says like, well, there's just one substance that exists. That's it. And that's God. And everything else is a mode of God. So you and I are modes, apparently. I don't understand how that works. It doesn't make any sense to me, but here's a metaphor for it. So there's a carpet, and there's little bumps in the carpet. You and I are just bumps in the carpet. God's the carpet. That's it. I'm like, okay. I find this it's a weird view, and Bukharev doesn't quite like it either. He's like, nah, that's not quite right. Shankara, who's like an Indian philosopher, his view is different. His view is the only thing that exists is God, and you think that you are distinct from God, and you think you're distinct from me. That's just an illusion. And so, in order to be saved, you got to get out of this illusion. But he also has this interesting argument, though, that I really like. People are like, well, if we're all in the state of like deep illusion, we can't have any knowledge of God. And Shankara's like, no, you've got knowledge of God. And you're like, how? And he's like, well, you know yourself, right? And you're like, well, yeah, I know myself. And he's like, well, then you know God, because you are God. Interesting kind of arguments. But here's a really serious objection to this version of pantheism. So the only thing that exists is God. And then I need to realize that I am identical to God in order to achieve liberation or salvation or enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. Well, who exactly is under the illusion? Because I don't actually, I'm not a distinct thing. God is the only candidate for a being that's in a state of illusion, but God's omniscient, according to Shankara. And I'm like, how does an all-knowing, perfectly wise being get in a state of like deep illusion where all of a sudden there's like a bunch of like minds running around thinking they're distinct and they're not? I'm like, how is that possible? Like, you need an explanation for that. And I don't think I don't know how you could explain that.
Right. And then that makes sense. And then one question I have is, many people propose that pantheism is not compatible with the contingency argument. Is that correct?
A lot of people do. And so this goes back to Andrei Bukharev's point, though, of there's not a nice agreement on how you like develop the metaphysics of pantheism. So it might be that God is identical to like a bunch of material stuff, but the shape of that stuff is like constantly in flux, you know? So you could say like, well, our universe exists, didn't always exist, but it came from a previous universe. And so it could be like there's a big bang, and then it like kind of like crunched back in on itself, and then it would bang again. And so you've got this like oscillating model of the universe. That cosmology doesn't work, but ignore that. What you'd be saying, you could say is it's all God. And so God is in this constant state of flux. So there's a lot of contingency in the world that needs explanation.
So you mean to say that forms are contingent, but the substance itself
necessary.
Fundamentally is necessary.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll be the idea.
Yeah.
And then you could say like, yeah, God's got a will. God doesn't know the future. You could do a lot of things with pantheism to get some contingency get a whole lot of contingency in the world. If you find it plausible or not, that's a separate issue. But there's a lot of things they could say to try to get some contingency in the world.
Okay. So do you find that plausible, or do you see an issue with that?
Well, I've already like described the two different versions of pantheism, but I'm just like that's crazy. Like God's in a state of illusion. Like, no, come on. Or I'm just a bump in the carpet that is God. It doesn't seem quite right to me. On Bukharev's view, God is just identical to the space-time universe. And there's this really, really complex story for how consciousness is supposed to be combined in interesting ways to develop unique minds. And I can't follow it is the biggest problem for me. It's very technical, and I have this feeling that I'm missing something, because there's supposed to be some kind of tight unity that you see in the universe that would explain why it's one thing and explain why it's conscious. But when I'm looking out at the world, I'm looking out my window and I see like a mountain outside, or if I'm in Philadelphia where I am right now, I'm looking out and seeing a bunch of like people driving by, and some cars and some trash and some drug addicts. And I'm like, how is all of this like in the building? How is all that unified together in an interesting way to say there's one mind there? It just looks like a collection of stuff to me. It doesn't look like any sort of interesting unity that would be a mind.
Yeah, and top of that, like if there is one doctrine that says that all of this is an illusion, I mean, that becomes more problematic. Like, how can this all? Me, myself, and a person next to me, you are also an illusion. I am also an illusion. You find that problematic?
I find that very, very problematic. Bukharev, he doesn't do the illusion stuff though.
Okay.
Which is one of the reasons. Well, there's a lot of reasons why I like Andrei, but this is just one of them. Is like he's like, no, none of this illusion stuff. It has to do with how you develop this account of unity. That I like I said before, I'm really struggling to follow. I feel like it's a lot of words, but I don't know if they really describe anything. That's the concern I have. But I don't think I've articulated that problem very well, because it's a super technical conversation that I don't know how to explain.
Yeah, that
off
makes
the top
sense.
of my head.
So another thing that comes to my mind related to pantheism is many people highlight that one of the biggest flaw within pantheism would be that good and evil are the same thing, or you cannot distinguish between good and evil. Do you find that a very strong critique?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, Mel Branch, in his dialogues on metaphysics and religion, he has some of his characters bring this argument up, going, surely, like someone like Berkeley or like these others, like surely they didn't really think that, because if you and I are sinning and you and I are God, then God's sinning, and God's got all these like sinful parts, and you can't be like perfectly good if you got a bunch of sinful parts. And they're like, surely Spinoza didn't really. He wasn't that dumb, like that's the way the characters talk. And Spinoza has one reply. Spinoza doesn't think that you and I are parts of God. You and I are modes of God. And so Spinoza could be like, well, yeah, God doesn't have sinful parts. I'm like, okay, fine. God has sinful modes. You can't,
Oh.
right? You can't. So I'm like, oh, you haven't really changed anything, right? Like like God cannot be perfectly good if he has a bunch of sinful modes. Like I just think that's a serious problem. And Spinoza does want to say God is good, and so I'm like, well, not that good.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's very interesting. Another thing that comes to my mind when I was going through aspects of pantheism is some epistemologists actually highlight that if you subscribe to something like pantheism, it is also problematic like atheism, where your reliability of your cognitive faculties can be subjected to skepticism. Is that what you agree with? Because now
Uh,
you don't have
yeah, keep going.
when you don't have like a to actually ground proper function, you need to have like God needs to have a will, and he needs to be a design. Your cognitive faculties have to be designed in some sense. But when you don't have that within a pantheistic view, then there are some issues with the reliability of your cognitive faculties, and you subscribing to some truth itself. What do you think about all this?
I think it's an interesting argument. It would work against some pantheistic thinkers. So, like,
Hmm.
I think Shankara, it would work against him. Spinoza,
Hmm.
maybe. I would need to think about that a little bit more. I don't think it's going to work against someone like Andrei Bukharev, because Andrei still has this idea that God is a mind and with a will, and is somehow kind of bringing about these like sub conscious things within the broader divine mind. So there's
Hmm.
still some kind of intentionality in what God is doing on Bukharev's view. So I don't think this particular argument would work against him, but it sounds like it would work against others, though.
Okay, yeah. And then if this is the view, then is it more inclined towards idealism, or do they also accept something like dualism and stuff like that?
Again, this is why it was so frustrating for me when Andre just like puts it out. Like, he's like, no one's worked out the metaphysics. I'm like, oh, right, because you've got someone like Spinoza who's got this dual aspect monism view. So like
Hmm.
all material things also somehow have like a mental aspect to them, and you're like, I don't understand how that works, but sure, okay, but that's a view you could have. Shankara's is an idealistic view,
Hmm.
and so, and then Bukharev's, well, God is the space-time universe, and so like really something like you've got some physical stuff and you got some mental stuff,
Hmm.
and it's unified in an interesting way. So yeah, there's too many different like metaphysical frameworks you could have for pantheism, for the kind of like certain kind of arguments to fit all of them.
Right. Right.
Mm.
Yeah. So, but then still, like some aspects, like I just cannot make sense of. Like I find them really problematic. As I've been studying these models of God more closely in my own research, I've come across some insightful critiques that highlight further issues. I'd like to share a few of these resources for those who want to explore the discussion more deeply. But before mentioning these resources, please note I'm not endorsing everything these authors say. I'm only highlighting them specifically for the philosophical critiques they offer of these models in question. So, the first one to note is see Apologetics in the New Age by David Clark and Norman Geisler, especially chapters 7, 8, and 10. Chapter 7 presents a broad metaphysical critique of pantheism. In trying to protect divine unity and infinity, pantheism often resists applying clear concepts to God, but this can leave the term God empty of meaning. At the same time, many forms of pantheism struggle to account for our deep and persistent experience of ourselves, other persons, and the world as real and distinct. Chapter 8 offers an epistemological critique of pantheism's appeal to mystical experiences. The authors argue that mystical experience is not a unique, self authenticating source of knowledge that bypasses reason or concepts. Because it still depends on interpretation, language, and logical distinctions, it cannot serve as an independent foundation for a pantheistic worldview. In chapter 10, they examine the problem of good and evil, arguing that pantheism struggles to make sense of real moral distinctions and the reality of suffering if everything is ultimately one. Together, these critiques suggest that pantheism faces serious difficulties at the level of meaning, knowledge, and morality. In addition to these classical critiques, there's also contemporary epistemological challenges to certain forms of pantheism, For example, recent work in Planting in Religious Epistemology argues that some monistic and impersonal forms of pantheism struggle to account for the reliability of our rational faculties. They briefly explain, if a worldview cannot explain why our reasoning is reliable, then any belief formed by that reasoning, including belief in pantheism itself, is called into question. In that sense, these forms of pantheism face a self undermining challenge similar to the one raised against naturalism. They risk sowing off the very branch of rationality they are sitting on. Another very important contemporary work is Eugene Nagasawa's book, The Problem of Evil for Atheists. While the title focuses on atheism, Nagasawa has a dedicated section analyzing the problem of evil for pantheism. His conclusion is striking. Nagasawa argues that pantheism faces a divinity problem of evil. If the world just is divine, then all suffering, horror, and moral atrocity are not merely permitted by the divine, they are literally parts or aspects of the divine reality itself. That makes evil harder to distance from the ultimate than in classical or neoclassical theism, where evil can be something God allows for a greater purpose. He then compares worldviews and suggests that classical theism has a structural advantage. It at least has conceptual room to explain why a perfect God might permit evil temporarily, whereas pantheism risks collapsing the distinction between the sacred and the horrific. In that sense, pantheism is not just equally challenged by evil, it may even be deeply threatened by it. I remember in one interview, he explained this point brilliantly. He explained how theism and pantheism both might face the problem of evil, but one has a potential solution for it, whereas one does not. So, when it's theism versus pantheism, in the context of problem of evil, the pantheist can either draw with theist or lose, whereas from a theistic perspective, the theist can either draw with pantheist or win in that sense. So, pantheism definitely has a bigger disadvantage when it comes to the problem of evil. Now, one last final philosophical issue that puts pressure on pantheism concerns the very idea of creation. If the world is identical with God or a necessary expression of the divine, then it becomes difficult to make sense of the world as something freely brought into being rather than something that simply had to exist. The doctrine of creation ex nihilo offers a very different picture, where the world is neither part of God nor a necessary outflow of the divine nature, but a contingent reality grounded in a free act of divine will. See Paul Coupin and William Lane Craig's Creation Out of Nothing. They explain how creation on this view is a free act rather than an emanation or necessary expression of the divine, which stands in sharp contrast to pantheistic models where the world is not truly distinct from God. Moving on to panentheism, I think you have a lot of work on this. So, what do you think is the biggest issue with panentheism?
The biggest problem is you can't get this group of people to agree on like anything. So like when I first got really interested in this would have been like around 2008 to 2010 during my master's. And so all the panentheists kept saying, we have a more scientific view of the world. We have a more intimate understanding of God in the world. And I'm like, we've got a better on like everything that you don't like, our view's better. And you're like, oh, okay, cool. And then I really like found it attractive. And then I started pushing it a bit deeper and realized, what is it? And there was this debate at the World Parliament of Religions, like in 2013, I think is when it was. And one of the guys that was asked to comment on the whole thing in his published work, he said, I left the room not understanding what panentheism is. I felt that if I committed myself to panentheism, I wouldn't have to change any of my beliefs at all. Like it's just too vague. And in a lot of my first big paper on the topic was just pointing this out of going, don't know what it is. Like you guys are too vague. And so the best I've been able to identify is this claim that they reject creation out of nothing. But you can still find some panentheists who say, actually, I affirm creation out of nothing. And I'm like,
oh, wow.
Okay, cool. Okay. So I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Can you
go ahead?
Can you highlight the difference between pantheism, monotheism, and panentheism? Like sometimes it's very confusing. What is panentheism? Is it between these two? What is it exactly?
It's supposed to still be monotheism. There's one God, and God is the ultimate foundation of reality. But the world is in God, and God is more than the world. This is the slogan. And Benedict Goeke is he's a really good German philosopher, and he has a lot of analytic theology as well. And he defends panentheism, and he's got a paper where he points out that it looks like if you're trying to just capture what everybody's saying, it looks like the only real agreement is this catchy slogan that the world is in God, but God's more in the world. And so he says, it looks like we just have to move to more like normative claims of like, this is what the panentheist should say if they want to have a coherent, instead of just trying to capture what everybody is saying. And that's my approach now, is to go, I don't know what you guys are saying, so I'll say stuff for you until you can sort out your own mess. So the claim is God has to exist with a universe of some sort. So he has to create, or maybe emanates, so Ibn Sina would then be a panentheist. Plotinus would be a panentheist. And they're usually listed in history books on panentheism. They're usually listed as panentheists. And then you've got to say something about how the universe is in God, but God is more than the world. And that needs to be kind of interesting and unique. And that's where I haven't been able to really find anything interesting or unique. I propose that space and time are attributes of God. And so the universe would literally be in God because it's in space and time. But some people like that proposal, some people didn't. And then I also know other people who reject panentheism and affirm that space and time are divine attributes. So I just kind of stick with God has to create or has to exist with a universe of some sort. And that's the best I can do in terms of demarcating panentheism.
Right. So like it's a huge issue, like what exactly it is, even if it's a word, like meaningfully trying to be able to fathom what it is or understand what it is, that isn't there. So there's nothing to actually address here because you don't even know what you're talking about. Is that correct?
Yes, and to give you an idea of like how relieved a lot of people were when I said this. So panentheism used to be like really like a big hot topic in Germany. Like all the German theologians for a good long while were just like, yeah, panentheism, this is the way to go. And I was a part of this religion and emotion research group for 3 years in Berlin. And one of the times I was there speaking, someone asked me about panentheism. Is this panentheism? And I was like, I've written 5 papers on panentheism and I don't know what panentheism is. It's too vague. And they all start laughing. And then they all said, I'm so glad to hear someone say this because I've thought this for so long. I didn't know what my colleagues were talking about. I'm so glad that someone's pointing this out. And I've had this experience a lot where people are going, oh, thank you, someone's finally saying it. So I thought it was the only one. I thought it was nuts. And then it turns out everyone's going, oh, finally. Okay, we can admit this now.
Wow, that's very interesting. If you want a deeper philosophical critique of panentheism, see Dr. Ian Mullins' paper, The Difficulty with Demarcating Panentheism. Dr. Mullins develops this issue further in later works. The recurring problem is this: many proposed definitions of panentheism either reduce to standard theism or slide into pantheism. So the debate becomes not just whether panentheism is true, but whether it is even a clearly defined position at all. For more accessible explanation, see this brilliant discussion where Dr. Mullins walks through this problem in detail. If a model cannot state what is uniquely true about God on that view, it risks collapsing into other positions. Without metaphysical clarity, panentheism can end up meaning almost anything, which philosophically risks meaning nothing specific. Another helpful resource here is Monotheism and Creation by David Cheetham. Cheetham explores how the doctrine of creation ex nihilo makes more sense. Creation ex nihilo establishes a real distinction between God and the world, presenting creation as a free act rather than something that flows from the divine by necessity. This stands in sharp contrast not only to emanationism and pantheistic models, but also to many forms of pantheism, where the world is understood as existing within or as an expression of the divine being. On a creation ex nihilo framework, God remains fully independent of the world, whereas panentheistic and pantheistic approaches can struggle to preserve that same level of divine freedom and ontological distance. Creation is then better understood as a freely given gift within its own integrity rather than a necessary unfolding of the divine life. So, coming back and summarizing what we have done so far, we did talk about divine simplicity. And as you highlighted, there are different models. There is classical theism, divine simplicity is a part of it. Then we have neoclassical theism. Then we had pantheism, panentheism. Is that correct? And like we still have to cover, I think, open theism. And we can go back to classical theism and neoclassical theism. We'll have a discussion on it. So what do you think are the issues with open theism?
So open theism, the claim that stands out to most people is that God does not have foreknowledge. God doesn't know the future. And a lot of people are like, whoa, that's outrageous. No one would have ever thought that. And you're like, well, Gersonides in the Middle Ages thought it. There's a big debate in the Catholic tradition over it, and a pope in the 1400s condemned it. So this view has been around for a while. This is not new. And it's not terribly far off from what Aristotle thought, that God didn't know any contingent truths. So knowing that you and I exist, like, that's, God doesn't know that stuff. So open theism is not like completely radical. Open theism thinks God knows more than what Aristotle's God knows. So, okay. So one of the big complaints is it's a diminishment of God's omniscience. Like you've lessened what God knows, because he doesn't know the future, so he's not really omniscient. The open theist, what they should say is, no. God knows all of the facts about reality. What will happen in the future, there's only a very small number of facts about what will happen in the future. And God knows those, but there's a whole lot of stuff about the future that there is no fact of the matter. There are no facts to know. So what you and I will do 5 minutes from now, God has like a very, very good idea of what you and I are going to do, because we're kind of predictable. So God is able to know the objective probabilities of what you and I will do. And he might even know for certain this is what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. But extending like further into the future, the probability of what will happen dwindles a bit. And so there's a lot of stuff about the future that's just probable, not what will happen. And so God knows what probably will happen, but not what will happen. And so he knows all there is to know.
So isn't that actually, in some sense, saying that there are some contingent facts, you're just denying their existence?
No, there are contingent facts. There's a contingent fact. So like, will I eat an apple 5 minutes from now? Well, if I do, that's contingent. If I don't, that's contingent. And God knows, I could or could not. I might or I might not. But will I? One view says it's just false. Like these are all false, because there is nothing to make them true yet. When they become true, well, then God knows. It's like, well, now Ryan's eating an apple. I know that. Okay. But like what? Like this is the idea. So God knows all the truths, and no falsehoods. But what is true is a bit different on this story, because the future is supposed to be open.
So then that is problematic, because you strip away the predictability of, like, God being able to predict what you're going to choose. Is that correct? That can be problematic.
This is a worry. So this is the more interesting worry that I have, because this omniscient stuff, like, oh, he's not really omniscient. I'm like, no, he knows everything there is to know. It's just God decided to create a kind of universe where the future's open. Okay, so he knows he created an open universe. That's not, what's the problem? There's no problem there. But now, like, the claim from the open theist is like, well, what's going to happen in the future is it's probabilities, what like, and God has to work with that.
Yeah, that within that model, yeah, it makes sense. But again, stripping away God having that kind of power to know, or I think it's foreknowledge, whatever, I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, foreknowledge.
Like, saying that God does not have that. So comparing the two models, where a God who has that is going to be greater than a God who does not have it. So now, even though Dr. Mullins himself is not fully convinced by open theism, he is still sympathetic to some of its motivations. However, as I mentioned, from an Islamic theological standpoint, there's no real space for open theism, pantheism, or panentheism. Scripturally and theologically, these models conflict with core Islamic teachings about God's knowledge and transcendence. So for a Muslim, that alone is already decisive. But for those interested in the philosophical debate, there are also many strong critiques of open theism that I found worth exploring. A known critique of open theism comes from Craig in The Only Wise God. One of the main reasons people are drawn to open theism is the concern that God's complete knowledge of the future might create serious problems. Craig argues that many of these worries come from misunderstandings and can be resolved without limiting God's knowledge. He offers models for how such knowledge could be possible. If that is right, then one of the main motivations for open theism is no longer necessary. For a clear philosophical critique of open theism, see Dr. David Hunt's video on this topic. He argues that denying future truths confuses truth makers with evidence. Consequently, the open theist move that there's nothing there to be known does not follow. Dr. Hunt explores three types of open theist and show how all three have some issues. You can see within this table he created. He also has a chapter in this book where he pushes a deeper challenge. If there really are true propositions about what free agents will do, then a being who does not know them lacks knowledge of truths. So, Dr. Hunt's critique presses two key issues: whether the future contains genuine truth and whether limiting God's knowledge of them weakens divine omniscience. So, Dr. Craig focuses on defending the coherence of divine foreknowledge and human freedom, while Dr. Hunt challenges the open theist claim that there are no definitive truths about future for God to know. For a wider ranging philosophical critique of open theism, this volume brings together multiple philosophers who argue that open theism struggles not just with foreknowledge and freedom, but also with deeper issues about time, truth, causation, and divine perfection. If you want to start with key chapters, look especially for the ones I'm highlighting. From an Islamic perspective, I don't think we don't have a room for either pantheism, panentheism, or open theism. Like there, I don't think, from my understanding, there's no room for these doctrines. And since you mentioned, there are some debates between open theist and neoclassical theist, etc. Maybe we can come back to those in the end part of the discussion. Let's
Sure.
go back to the most meaty part of the discussion, which is the dispute between the dispute between classical theism and neoclassical theism. So one part we addressed was divine simplicity, and we tried to look for rational issues within divine simplicity. And we also saw scriptural issues with divine simplicity. There's one more that you highlight, I think, which was something that really moved me. Was one of your articles on use of cognitive science, and making a case of how, from an intuitive perspective itself, divine simplicity, it's going to be really problematic for a god, if it's a divinely simple god, to create us with these kind of tendencies of god in something along those lines. Can you highlight that and how that also critiques divine simplicity?
Yeah. So there's a scholar in Helsinki in Finland named Larry Launinen, and so Larry is an expert on cognitive science of religion, and then he also does a lot of systematic theology and philosophy of religion. And so he really liked my work, and so when I was living and working in Finland, he was like, we should write a paper on this. What we could do is we could look at different models and see which ones cognitive science takes to be more intuitive. And I was like, okay, that's cool. Tell me more. And so eventually that's how this paper came together that you're referring to. And so the big idea was we looked at some of the different attributes, and then Larry looks at all these studies that have been done in cognitive science on people's intuitions about God. So things like God being completely unchanging, or God's not really having any emotional reaction to you. These are things that people were like, no, like it goes against a lot of intuitions, which is interesting because I think it depends how you ask the question. So if I ask people, do you think God is timeless? Like lots of people are like, yeah, of course. Like he transcends time. They don't know what time is. No, they don't have a clue what they're saying, but they're like, yeah, that sounds cool. Like God's transcending time. Why not? But if I tell people, do you think God does one thing and then another? And most people are like, yeah, that's fine. Who cares? I'm like, we'll think God's not timeless. Do you think God exists right now? And a lot of people are like, yeah, sure, that's fine. Well, then you don't think God's timeless, because a timeless being cannot have temporal location. A timeless being cannot undergo succession. So a timeless being cannot do one thing and then another. And so when you explain to people some of these attributes, they start to sound really counterintuitive all of a sudden. And so this is some of the stuff that Larry was like looking at a lot of research on this to bring to the paper and go, it's really weird that God would end up being completely unknowable, like simplicity demands. And it's really weird that God would be like completely against all of our counterintuition, like against our intuitions, but God's the one who created the world, and God's the one who gave us these intuitions. Like, Like, why, if God wants us to be close to him, then why is he like giving us these intuitions that go in the exact opposite direction of what God is like? That just seems really, really weird.
Exactly. So I think in terms of, we have these intuitions. I mean, even scripture talks about it, even rationally demands it. Then how can you, on all these three levels, if it's like that doctrine is being refuted, how can someone still actually adhere to it? Like I think sometimes, I like your work because you are so passionate about actually sometimes going against divine simplicity and classical theism, and I really like that. I'm like, yeah, this is what you should do, because what this part highlighted is that
Mhm.
from a practical level also, like we need that kind of a God who's worthy of worship, in the sense that, okay, he listens to my prayer, he understands me,
Mhm.
he cares for me, his love is actually meaningful, not something that is identical to everything else. But when you propose such a doctrine, I think that is very problematic. Yeah, so you can expand on that.
Yeah, so because everybody has different doubts that they struggle with. Some people
Hmm.
doubt that God exists. I've never doubted that God exists. For me, the question, like when I'm experiencing doubt, is does God care about me?
Hmm.
Could God actually care about me? Uh, and and so one of the underlying motivations, there's a lot of underlying motivations for why I'm doing the research that I'm doing, but one of them is I want to know if God is the kind of being that could actually care about me. And some of these models of God, if it turns out they're true, then God cannot care about me. So, like, if Aristotle's God turns out to be that's the way the world is, I'm like, well, that's nice, I guess, but he cannot know that I exist. So if he can't care about me, so why should I care about him? I mean, so like what
Hmm.
like it's like there's a lot of things about the way I think about faith, the way I think about commitments to God, all of that would have to go out the window. Which, if that's the way the world is, then it's going to have to go out the window. But I don't think that's the way the world is. I don't.
Hmm. That makes sense. And I think what I really liked about that article, coming back to it,
Hmm.
is that cognitive science is also a very important tool, which we can use as, and theologians should use. Like, for example, Dr. Justin Barrett, in his book Theopsych, a philosophical science primer for theologians, actually talks about how in today's time, like when we talk about intuitions and many other things, um, cognitive science is an important tool that we need to rely on to understand, like what is what kind of intuitions do we have universally across all cultures. And sometimes
Hmm.
there are some things within us which are, despite of culture, they are untaught, non-inferentially developed automatically without cultural influence on us. So these things are very important in the sense, like, we have at least some idea of a god. It's like some idea of a god is very intuitive to us, or some idea of morality is intuitive to us, some idea of purity is intuitive to us. And this is how we function. Like, even if you keep, no, like, children, you raise children on an island without any human culture, they still would gravitate towards meaning, purpose, some kind of morality, some idea of a creator designer, in a very basic sense,
Hmm.
that's there. So this is what God has installed within us. We can clearly say that if God created us, then this is like, in from an Islamic perspective, we call this the fitra, which is that some kind of natural disposition. And cognitive science and fitra don't exactly align, but they have a lot of overlap.
Right. There's something in the neighborhood, right?
Yeah, so from that perspective, yeah, you can say that, okay, so what kind of a god would give me this kind of fitra? Like, I can just, you understand that, like, if
Hmm.
if that god himself completely contradicts the idea of god that he has given me, I mean, that's a huge problem. That's a huge theological problem, where, like, our natural intuitions give us an idea of god which is not completely timeless.
Hmm.
We have naturally have an idea of god to be in time. But then that itself, I think, within neoclassical theism, we can make sense of that, because we do believe that god is anytime. I think
Hmm.
scripture itself, in some sense, leads us to the conclusion that yes, god has to be in time. Like, it's more compatible, I would say, with
Hmm.
scripture. So maybe I forgot where I was going. But, like,
Hmm.
coming back to neoclassical theism
Hmm.
and classical theism. Okay, so let me just clarify this aspect. So I come from the Athari Creed. So within Sunni Islam, we have like three different schools of thought, and this is for my audience to understand, is
Hmm.
that there's Asharis, Maturidis, and Athari. We all three within these creeds reject divine simplicity. But when it comes to other uh, attributes in classical theism, there can be a difference where some reject them, some don't reject them, but Atharis reject all four of classical theism, and that's why you can clearly call them a neoclassical theism in the fullest sense, because they're rejecting all four of those attributes that divine simplicity ascribes. So maybe we can tackle them one by one. One is, let's start with time. So within the Islamic tradition, I think you had a very brilliant discussion with Raymond Harvey on how there were two different models on God's relationship to time, and I think you were defending the Athari perspective. So why would you think that God has to be in time? What would be your strongest argument?
So Harvey and I disagree on a few different points. One of them is the entailments from creation ex nihilo. So creation ex nihilo says, this is a quote from Al-Maturidi, by the way, that prior to the existence of the universe, there's God all alone. So first there's God alone, and then there's God with the universe. And so you see this in Al-Maturidi, you see this in Al-Ghazali, you see it in everybody in the Christian tradition as well, and a lot of Jews as well. Like, this is just what is creation ex nihilo. And then Ibn Taymiyyah, when he's rejecting creation ex nihilo, he's like, yeah, that's what creation ex nihilo means. Something begins to exist when it is preceded by non-existence. So the universe begins to exist, then there has to be this prior state where it didn't exist. So there's just God and nothing else. And then God plus all this other stuff. Well, you've got God all alone, and then God with the universe. That's a change. Like, you've got a before, you've got an after. And so God can't be timeless, because God cannot have a before and after if God is timeless. Because to be timeless is to exist without succession, without temporal location, without any temporal relationships. So before and after, that's a temporal relationship. Before and after, that's a succession. So it's not going to be timeless.
I'm so glad that you gave a very simple answer, because like sometimes you go into these theories of absolute theory of time and relational theory of time, sure. And sometimes before, like, now I'm catching on, but sometimes I'm like, I used to scratch my head, like, what is going on here? I don't understand anything.
I've written 2 books on God and time, and it's the philosophy of time is it's one of the most difficult issues. So there you go. By the way, so your audience knows, from Divine Timemaker to Divine Watchmaker, the ebook version is now free. It's free to download. Because the University of Helsinki, when I wrote it there, and they have an obligation to the Finnish taxpayers to make things open access. So they paid all the open access fees. So now, as of just like earlier this week, that book is free to download.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
So, so what was I saying?
We were saying, like, when you, like, it's easier to explain, like, God does one thing and then another. Okay, well, he's not timeless. I can go into all the really technical stuff about absolute relational time and A theory, B theory. I do all of that, but it's really as simple as this. Does God do one thing and then another? If you say no, he's timeless. If you say yes, he's temporal. That's it.
Yeah, maybe some other day I would love to have a conversation on that. So, because that is very complex, and sometimes people ask me, Lord, what is God's relationship to time? And generally I tend to not give them a clear, not give them all of this, like this kind of jargon with A theory of time, B theory of time is there. This metaphysical time and this physical time, and there's so much out there. So, but yeah, in simple terms, God acting in sequence is enough to show how God is not timeless. But then there is one issue that comes in, is that people think that just because God is in time, he becomes a prisoner of time, or there's some contingency involved comes within God, and they define that problematic. So if you can address just that, I think most of the issue that people see with God being in time gets resolved.
So I'll tell you how Richard Swinburne answers it, and then I'll tell you how somebody else like Isaac Newton can answer it. So Swinburne says, okay, fine. So God was all alone prior to creation, and then God created a universe, and then he's sustaining it, and then. So now, like, God's trapped in this flow of succession.
Mm-hmm.
Well, well, God knew that was going to happen. Like that's just the logical consequence of freely performing an action. And God knew that before he decided to do it. And he thought, yeah, this is fine. This is a good idea. So what's the big deal? Like, so I think a better way to put it than Swinburne is to go, so God's the prisoner of the logical consequences of his own action. That's oh gosh, terrible prisoner. You know, like it's no big deal. It's no big deal to be like, yeah, this is just the logical consequences of performing an action. If God is all powerful, this is not a strike against his power or anything. So what's the big deal?
Right.
Another way to do it. So Isaac Newton, he says that absolute time is an essential divine attribute. So there's a sense in which God is time, because time is an attribute of God or a mode of God. He says the same thing about space, but I don't understand space, so we're going to ignore space. So if you've got this view, then the prisoner of time objection is like, God is a prisoner of his own essence. And you're like, is that a problem? No. Like, God is essentially all powerful. Oh, he's a prisoner of his own power. You know, God necessarily exists. Oh, he's a prisoner of his own necessary existence. You know, oh gosh, he's like forced to know all the things. Oh God, this is really terrible. And you're like, there's no problem here. So I think when you put it in those kind of terms, this idea of like he's a prisoner, it's just silly.
Right. And then that would be in the absolute theory of time. Within the relational theory of time also this can be defended?
Maybe. The relational theory of time says time's not actually a thing. Time is reducible to some non-temporal stuff in the world. You get a lot of problems with that, but we're not going to go into those. But the claim is that if change occurs, then time exists in some kind of sense. So God knows that if he wants to perform an action, well, he's going to have to bring about a change, because there's the change from not doing something to doing something. So God's like, yeah, this is the logical consequences of me freely exercising my absolute power. You're going to tell me I can't exercise my absolute power? Like, come on. Like,
right.
So yeah, that's the way a relationalist could answer it.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, time maybe we can have another discussion on it. For my audience, a very, very simple explanation. Of course, your book is there, which is arguing from, let's say, an absolute view of time. There's William Lane Craig, who actually argues from a relational theory of time. Coming back to just from an atheist standpoint, with a very simple papers which can argue for this, would be one paper by Basim Zawadi. I'll put it on the screen. Another is by Jake Muslim, the Muslim metaphysician, and one book is Between the God of the Prophets and the God of the Philosophers. That book actually addresses some of these discussions. So coming back to our topic, like classical theism, because we are short for time, so I'll try to cover them swiftly. Sure. Classical theism view gave two aspects. We did cover divine simplicity in depth. We did cover timelessness to some extent. Then there's two more. There's one, impassibility and immutability. That is one by one, if you can explain.
So immutability means God cannot change. God cannot change in any way, shape, or form. And you might go, well, what about this kind of, no. What about this other kind of change? No change. What part of no change do you not understand? Some people will be like, well, can he change relationally? I'm like, no, to change relationally is to still have a before and an after. If you can undergo relational changes, then you have sequence, you have succession, and that you're changing. That's why it's called a relational change. So God's not going to be timeless. So any argument against timelessness is also going to be an argument against immutability. And so the argument I just gave earlier about God all alone, then God with stuff, he's changed. So immutability's gone. So that was fast. We're done with that one.
The one thing is that why do they have a problem with change happening within God, and how do you accept that if there is a change, I don't know, intrinsic, extrinsic, how do you explain? But there is, it's not problematic, but within their models they consider it to be problematic. So why is change not problematic, and why do they think it is problematic?
Yeah. So there's this underlying assumption that you see in Plato, and it gets repeated a lot throughout Western history. All change is for the better or worse. And so, God's perfect. Okay, well, can God get better? No, he's perfect. Like, okay, if you could get better, you weren't perfect. Can God get worse? Well, no, if you could get worse, you weren't that great. You weren't the greatest, clearly, if you could get worse. So God can't change. Okay. That's the argument. And it's really simple. It's easy to follow. And you're like, right, okay, cool. Like all changes have been ruled out because all changes for the better or worse. Now, I think it's false, though. I think it's false that all changes for the better or worse. And I think also further that sometimes some perfections require change. So let me address, which one do you want me to address, I guess? There's two different points. I don't know. I could do both if you want. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, both is fine. Both is fine.
Okay. So let's start with all changes for the better or the worse. So imagine that there are two electrons that exist. That's the only thing that exists. Just two electrons spinning in the void. One's here, one's there. At the next moment, they switch places. There's a change. Is that better? Is that worse? I don't know how you could say it's better or worse. Like I picked the most boring possible change I could think of to really emphasize there's nothing better, there's nothing worse. It's just different. And the fact that some things can be just different, that's enough to show that all change is for the better or worse. That's false. Absolutely false.
Oh, it's that simple.
Yeah, because the claim is all change is for the better or worse. And you're like, well, you just need one counterexample. We gave one. Okay, we're done.
And then there was another, you said that, where change is better for change, perfection requires change.
Yeah, so it might be entailed by certain perfections. So William Hasker has this kind of view. He's got this argument where he says, if God's really omniscient, God knows all the things there are to know, well, reality is constantly changing. So the stuff that's happening right now, what's going on right now, well, that's constantly changing. So God's omniscience demands that God change because he needs to constantly keep track of what's going on in the world. So the truth values of the truths that are true now, that's constantly changing. And so God's not going to be perfect unless he's changing. The exercise of God's absolute power is maximal power. Well, to freely perform an action is to go from not doing something to doing something. I want to do this, now I'm doing it. Like just to act for a reason is just entails change. So perfect rationality, perfect free will, omnipotence, they logically entail that God has to change. If he's going to exercise his power, he's going to change.
Right. So yeah, that was a brilliant point. I think I like how you can cover such complex topics with such simple examples and bring the point forward. Now let's go to so we covered impassibility, we covered immutability. So now there is impassibility. What that is?
Yeah. So it's typical to say God cannot suffer. And this is a common claim with impassibility, but you have to ask why? Like why God can't suffer? Like what's the big deal? And so there's these underlying claims that are more interesting. And so the underlying claim is it is impossible for God to have any emotion that is irrational. That seems fine because you don't want God having irrational emotions. It's impossible for God to have immoral emotions. Again, that seems fine because you don't want God having like immoral emotions. Like God has like anger towards you, but you're like, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, that'd be irrational. If you did something wrong, well, it's rational anger. Okay, you want God having rational anger, not irrational. The final claim though is God cannot have any emotion that is inconsistent with perfect happiness. And you're like, whoa, how did we get there? Yeah. And so here's how we got there. And so here's what impassibility is really saying at rock bottom. God cannot be moved or influenced by anything outside of himself for his beliefs, his emotions, and his actions. So nothing about you or me, nothing about anything else in the universe can influence God to think, feel, or act in any particular way. It's a logical impossibility. Instead, all of God's emotions, all of God's actions, all of God's beliefs, they are only grounded in the greatest good, which is himself. So his beliefs are only about himself, can be influenced by himself. His actions, his emotions can only be about himself. That's why he's perfectly happy, because he's in perfect alignment with the greatest good. And he can't be influenced by you in any way. That would be irrational if he was influenced by you. Like, he got mad at you for that sin you did. Well, that's irrational. You're not focused on the greatest good anymore, and you ask for forgiveness and God's like, oh, I'm happy that you forget. No, you can't be happy because you've repented. That'd be basing my emotions on things that are less than the greatest good. Yeah, that's impassibility.
Wow. So I mean that sounds really problematic. Like I just can bring, for example, that would not be consistent with scripture again.
I was going to say, I'm
Let's say,
sure
for
you've got a bunch
example,
of scriptures you want to bring up.
yeah, yeah. So, for example, God has wrath, and God is getting displeased with them, or for example, God does not like the wrongdoers. I mean, I could have got many different examples. About when it comes to God being pleased with someone or God being displeased with someone. So this would not fit within this model. Is that correct?
Right. So let's look at that middle one here. They've earned God's wrath. Um,
Right.
why? Well, because they're wicked deeds. Like there's an explanation for why God is angry at them. Here's the problem: impassibility has to say God cannot be angry at you because of something you've done, because you can't influence God. So James Dozel, there's a 4 Views debate book on impassibility, came out a few years ago. James Dozel says, our sins, be they ever so many, have no influence on God. And so what you have to do when you come to passages like this is you go, well, God has wrath, but it's metaphorical. It's not literal. And you're like, okay, cool. What is it a metaphor for? Because when someone says there's a metaphor for something. It's going to point to some literal reality. And
Right.
the passage says you sinned, and that's why God's angry at you. The literal truth is you sinned, and God's perfectly happy and isn't influenced by you, but he's punishing you. And then that's usually how the story goes from Impassibilists. Like, he's punishing me. Why is he punishing me? Well, because you sinned. I'm like, well, but his actions cannot be influenced by me. So why is he punishing me? And it has to be, I don't know what you say at that point, because the explanation can't be anything about me. That cannot be why God's punishing me, because then God would be influenced by me.
Yeah, I mean that's not making sense
No.
to me actually. Because like if God, so God if is getting angry, and if God is, for example, God is getting like, we do have some impact, like our sinning can have some impact, right? If you say that there is, like, if we are earning God's wrath, it's because of the sin. If am I correct, right? So
Yeah.
that sounds really problematic. Why do they have to adhere to this? I mean, this does not fit well with scripture. Like, I had more verses, I don't know if I
But
can.
why are they thinking this? Yeah, because that's the thing is, I mean, I just go through the Jewish scriptures and then eventually point out a couple New Testament passages, because there's just so much where it's like God is angry about your sins. He loves you for repenting. He's happy when you do this. He's pleased by your good deeds. It's just shot through all of the Abrahamic faiths that God is a rational agent that is having rationally appropriate emotions, because he's mad when it's right to be mad. He's having empathy when it's the right time to have empathy. It's loving when it's right to, it's just a different view entirely from this classical view.
So God's love would be meaningless from that perspective?
Not okay. Let me be more charitable. So they're going to say God's love is self-love, because God's love, the only appropriate object for God's love is the greatest possible good, which is himself. And then somehow, in a way that is never clearly articulated, God's self-love kind of trickles down to you and I.
Oh, okay.
So they're gonna, want to say it's still meaningful. God's love is meaningful, but that's part of the background claims they have to make, though.
So
sure.
Before we move into the topic, like, I just wanted you to give a brief of both of these work of yours. What do you do in each of the work?
So everything that we were just talking about for the past few minutes is all in God and emotion. So God and emotion is an introduction to this debate over impassibility versus passibility. And it's short and sweet. It's like 60 pages long, I think. It had to be really short. So this is the format for the series. So it's just an introduction to philosophy of motion, and then this debate between classical and neoclassical theism on impassibility versus passibility. And so I've got a whole chapter just on God's wrath, God's anger, where I go through all the stuff that we just talked about. Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God. This is an introduction to philosophical theology. And I wanted to write something that was concise, something that was a bit more devotional, that still has all the academic rigor, but clarity. And then also something that was way more sarcastic than what publishers usually let me get away with. So it describes what I think God is like right now, because my beliefs might change later on. But what I think about God right now, and then some problems that don't typically get addressed, such as why would God create anything at all? Why would God create this particular universe? Trying to look at different theories of providence. And then there's this one problem I'd not really seen addressed, and some friends were really asking me to, which is, if God knows the future, how is he passable? Wouldn't that screw up his emotions? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. That's weird. And so that's the last chapter is addressing that question.
Okay, yeah, that sounds really brilliant. So just for my audience to understand that from our theological creed, I think it's very strict in terms of using words and terms that we ascribe on God. So maybe the word emotion itself, we might not directly use that, oh, God has emotions, but yes, what the scripture itself affirms for God, we can see clearly, like you can earn God's love or God's wrath. So I think what you argue does overlap a lot with the Athei creed, and that's what I really like about your about your work is that you the kind of critique that you have, that those are the kind of critiques that I think about you. Of course, you formally laid them down very nicely, but like, for example, God's relationship to time, I always used to think that, okay, yeah, this is an issue that people have to deal with, and God's relation, this aspect of emotion, as you mentioned. I don't like using the word emotion itself because it's a very loaded word.
Sure.
But
yeah,
these things do actually do exist within both of our scriptures, and like the theological side of it, some do, like, of course many did, but many don't acknowledge that, okay, yeah, if you make theology that it goes against the scripture itself. So we need to have harmony between them, and classical theism creates huge problems and cannot create the harmony between scripture, that like the God of the prophets, the God which is described in the God that is in scripture, and what this kind of systemized theology gets. So I think from that perspective, we can come back to what we were talking about, which is classical theism and neoclassical theism. And I think we have seen all four attributes within classical theism have huge issues. They are not compatible at times with our intuitions, or they are not compatible with scripture itself, and sometimes they're not even compatible with reason itself. So neoclassical theism makes most sense to me out of all of those five models that you provided, which is, let's say, open theism is there, pantheism, panentheism, classical theism, and classical theism. And my creedal school does affirm, or is closest to, even though there are these terms and there might be some issues here and there on a deeper level, but it does fits within neoclassical theism. So let's move on to neoclassical theism. There are some objections that people try to bring in against neoclassical theism. So maybe we'll try to address that, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you might find this objection really implausible, but there some people say that aseity of God does entail divine simplicity. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think this is false. Aseity means that God's existence is not dependent upon nor derived from anything else. And then God's self-sufficiency means that God's perfection, his essential attributes, are not derived from nor dependent upon anything else outside of God. And so God just independently exists. That's what aseity really comes down to. And I don't know why I need simplicity for that. Like Samuel Clarke, who I mentioned earlier, he gives his argument from contingency to the necessary and independent existence of God, and he doesn't go anywhere near simplicity. So yeah, usually what I see is when people define aseity, they sneak in simplicity. So they'll be like, to be ase is to have independent existence, to be purely actual, to be, and you're like, hang on, you just snuck in some extra stuff here. So usually it's just kind of question begging. Or what they'll do is they'll add some extra principles, like everything that's distinct is a component part, and component parts need to have some third thing that composes them. And so they're bringing in a bunch of extra stuff. And I'm like, well, aseity by itself is just independent existence. If you want to bring other stuff to the table, that's fine. That's a debate we can have. We had it earlier in this episode,
Right.
but it's not aseity.
Right. So yeah, this brings me to the next question, which is that they say that composition entails causal dependence. So how would we address that? We say, like you did actually already address this, which is that we don't take God's attributes as composite parts. Is that correct?
That's
Yeah.
the main thing, is be like, why on earth should I think like that God's attributes are parts? But there's a deeper claim you can make too, though, because it wasn't. There's two principles. One is like, anything distinct as a part. And I'm like, why should I think a thing like that? The second one is anything that has parts needs to be composed by some third thing. There's a lot of things in discussions on mereology, like parts and wholes, that deny this. So there are views where the whole is more fundamental than the parts. And so the whole explains why the parts. So the thing itself explains why it has parts. There's something called mereological essentialism, where something has parts essentially. So the parts cannot come apart. That's a view you could affirm. So this principle that if for any case of composition, you need something outside of it that does the composing, it's not affirmed by everybody who does mereology, and we've got some intuitions and arguments for thinking it's false.
Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. One thing that I want you to address, maybe the 5 models that you provided, there can be, I don't know if there would be a 6th one in this, which is something now getting a bit popular, which is that limited God hypothesis, which people think that, okay, yeah, we can propose a limited God. For example, Philip Goff proposed the model. So how would you critique that as well?
So Andrei Bukharev, his book on pantheism, he has this line about Goff in there going, the metaphysics have not been worked out at all. There's no explanation for why God has these limits. There's no explanation for anything. And from the perspective of philosophy of mind, it's a disaster. It's something like this. This is Andre, not me. But I agree though. Like the sort of hypothesis that Goff is floating cannot serve as an ultimate explanation, because an ultimate explanation is supposed to be the stopping point, like where there's no meaningful questions to ask, like, why is this? Why is that? Like you can't do that anymore. Whereas Goff's account of God has too many arbitrary limits. It's like, why does it have this limit here and there and there and there? And so it cries out for further explanation. So it can't be an ultimate explanation. That's the main point. There's ways I could develop that more, but that's the big idea.
Yeah, but then that same issue would come with any other limited God hypothesis. Is that correct? Where,
yeah, exactly.
Would not be an ultimate explanation.
Correct.
Right.
Now, there's a difference so there's limits, and then there's self-limitations. So some views will say God necessarily limits himself, which sounds like really cool and interesting and intriguing. I don't think it's actually that interesting, because the idea is this: there are logical consequences for God's actions. Like when God creates something, well, then that entails like other things can't be done now. God can't change the past. It's too late. If God's deciding, what do I want to create first? An electron or an angel? Well, he creates an angel first. Well, now he can't create an electron first. He's limited. Oh no. So this idea of like whatever action God performs, there are consequences for it, and that is a sense limiting, but it's just logical limits. So there's a lot of stuff God can't do because it's just the consequences of what he has decided to do, and that's not terribly interesting, because you do have the explanation built in. You're like, that's just what it means to have free actions. Whereas Goff's view is like God can't do a whole bunch of stuff because there's these laws of nature that are floating around, and like, where did they come from? And there's this other physical stuff, and like, where did that come from? He might be able to come up with a story at some point. It's fine, but he needs to do it. He needs to give us the story.
Right. So one thing is, which I see you address very nicely, which is coming to the concept of God itself. Some people, like when you're talking about limitation itself, some people ask this question, okay, now we understood that, okay, God exists, but can God lie? Why can't he not lie? So how would you address that?
Yeah, I don't know if God can lie or not. I don't think God can do anything sinful. That seems right to me. Why? So to be all powerful, omnipotence is the most power granting set of abilities and no liabilities. So let me explain that. In English, There's lots of things that I refer to as an ability, but it's a bit of a sloppy term in English, because some things that I call abilities, they're actually liabilities or weaknesses. So I have the ability to be irrational. Is that really a power, or is that a weakness? It's a weakness, I think. So that's going to be excluded from the most power granting set of abilities, because it's not really a power. I've got the ability to be mistaken in my beliefs. You do too. That kind of sucks. It's not a powerful thing. So that's going to be excluded, but in English, I can call it an ability. So God, if God's going to have the most power granting set of abilities and no liabilities, no weaknesses, that's going to logically entail that God is going to be omniscient. He's going to have all the right beliefs, and he's going to be perfectly rational, because the ability to be irrational, that's a weakness. So God's always appropriately responsive to reasons. One set of reasons to be responsive to are moral facts, moral values. So if God's going to know everything, he's going to know what all the moral facts are. And if he's perfectly rational, he's going to be appropriately responsive to all of the moral facts. So he's never going to do anything that's sinful or morally wrong. Now, can he lie? In a lot of cases, lying is morally wrong. Some cases is morally justified. So this is why I'm like, I don't think God's going to lie, for the most part, but there might be a couple of cases where he needs to not give you the whole truth. But I don't know. I do think that God cannot make himself incredibly obvious to humanity. I think he's got some reasons to remain hidden. But that's a different issue than is he lying? And my answer is I don't really know. There might be a case where God needs to lie, but I don't know.
Yeah, previously I've seen some of your take on this question, and you were considering lying to be a liability. And if lying is actually a liability, then of course God has all abilities and not liability. So in that sense, God cannot lie. Is that correct?
That would be right. But I don't know if lying is always a weakness, because the standard example that you get in moral philosophy is an axe murderer. He comes knocking on your door and he's looking for your mother. And he's like, "Where's your mom?" And if you tell him where your mom is, this guy's he's an axe murderer. He's nuts. And so you're like, "Oh, my mom's not here. She's over there." And the guy runs off the other direction. That's totally morally justified. There's nothing morally wrong with lying in that case. And that seems like it might be that lying is a skill and not necessarily an ability, because the ability is to use reason and language to perform certain actions. And lying might be a skill in this case. And did you use it? Did you use that skill well? Did you use it poorly? I don't know. I'm not a moral philosopher, so I don't know how to parse out all these things.
Right. Well. Yeah, but then the point remains that all of God's decisions are going to be moral. This is what reason dictates, right?
Correct. Yeah, that's the underlying claim. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one more question comes to my mind, which was not initially there, but I just want to know your view. So, what is morality? Do you consider morality to be objective, and how can that be grounded in God?
So I do think it's objective, yes. And I do think there are basic moral facts. They might be very, very thin, like don't cause unnecessary harm. And you're like, okay, it's necessarily true. Well, now I got to figure out what is harm. Well, that kind of depends on the things that exist, their natures. And so it might be that when God creates certain kinds of creatures, then that fills in some more thicker moral facts. So God all alone, there's this basic principle of don't cause unnecessary harm. Cool. All right. Well, if I'm going to create humans, well, they have a particular kind of nature, and there's certain things that harm them. So now what God is doing when God creates humans, God's creating some additional moral facts that give a more thicker detail. That's the idea. So he doesn't create don't cause unnecessary harm. You can't create that. But what it means to harm humans, God's bringing that about. That he's filling in the moral details when he creates a universe.
Okay, yeah. But then, some people, they mention that God's nature is good. How do we make sense of that?
There's a couple different things you could say. So one is goodness in terms of just value, because not all goods are moral goods. There's lots of other kind of goods. And so you could say that God's the most valuable thing in existence because he's got all the perfections, all the great making properties, and all potential value, all potentially good things are grounded in God, because God has the ideas in his head of all the possible things he could create. And so when God's thinking about all the things he could create, he's like, that has potential value. If I made it and I created it, it would be valuable. So that's, in one sense, you could say God's all good in this kind of sense. When we talk about God being morally good, that's where I think God's perfect rationality has to come into play. God is morally good in the sense of he's always appropriately responsive to the moral facts of the situation. So he's going to always satisfy his obligations, if he has obligations, because he doesn't have obligations in a bunch of different respects. But if he makes a promise, he's going to keep it. If he creates a universe, there's certain obligations that come with that. He's going to maintain those. He's always going to be perfectly virtuous in his actions. And he's going to try to bring about the best possible consequences he can, if there is a best possible consequence for any given action. So this would be like how you'd start trying to tease out God's moral goodness.
Right. Someone was saying, and I don't know if it's correct or not, I heard it, was saying that if you have omniscience and omnipotence, then you can directly derive omnibenevolent also, like God being all good. Because if God is omniscient, then he knows all moral facts as well, and if he has if he's omnipotent, then he can bring out those states in some sense. So if you believe in both of them, then it does entail this as well. Is that correct?
I think so. And so if anybody reads my little book about a big God, in my chapter where I lay out the essential attributes of God, I start with God having the most power-granting set of abilities. And what I derive from God's omnipotence is this maximal cognitive excellence, which covers God's beliefs, it covers his rationality, and it covers his emotions. And then from there, you can logically derive perfect goodness, perfect free will, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, so I think these kind of arguments, I think they're very strong.
Wow, that makes sense. This brings me to one very, very interesting question, at least for me, is theism coherent, which you recently had a debate. So some people, they just try to deny theism or be against theism because they say that theism itself is not a coherent concept. So what do you have to say about that?
I mean, the long story short is I think it is coherent. Because the basic concept of God is a perfect being, which is the ultimate foundation of reality. And so to show that it's incoherent, you would need to identify some of the attributes that everybody agrees on and say that one of those is incoherent. And I don't think any of those are. Or you'd have to try to show each model of God is incoherent. There's no coherent models left. Which is a bigger task, but I think it's a good one because you do see these disagreements over exactly what people think God is like. So if you really want to show that the idea of God is incoherent, you either try to show that something that all of the models agree on is incoherent, or you go one by one and show each model is incoherent. That's what you'd have to do, which is a big task, but maybe you could do it. I don't know.
Right. And I think what you propose, I think is pretty robust, which is perfect being theology, and God has all great making properties. Can you very briefly explain what perfect being theology is?
Yeah. So perfect being theology, you just start with this idea that whatever God is perfect. He's the greatest possible being. And then I look for the attributes that look like they would be things that a perfect being would have. So attributes that we call them great making. They make them greater. They're better to have than not have. And so it's a method for trying to go through and identify what those attributes are and see how they fit together. So and I go through all that in more detail in my little book about a big God. That's one of the methods I try to lay out to help people begin to think about God.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. My last question, maybe my last or my second last question would be, what is truth and what's God's relationship to truth itself?
So I'm going to give you the really boring, like kind of analytic philosophy answer, which is just truth is just stating the way things are. So truth, I think, is a property that applies to a proposition. And so a proposition is true if it accurately describes the way the world is, and it's false if it doesn't. There's a lot of statements that theists like to make that God is truth. And I sometimes I think I know what that means. Sometimes I don't. I know what it means to say God knows all the truths. He's a truth teller. And if I really want to know like the ultimate truths about reality, I need to know God. So in that sense, God is truth. I'm like, I know what that is. If there's something stronger than that, I don't know what that stronger claim exactly is.
Okay. Yeah, I think I get you on that part. Now my last question would be a very personal question,
Mhm.
which is that you as a theologian, and I know theology as a field itself is mind-boggling.
Mhm.
So do you actually in your whole journey have had moments where you're like just banging your head on the wall? I'm like, yeah, I can't understand this, man. This is so confusing. Have you had those moments?
All the time. Oh my gosh, yeah. Like one of the most frustrating things is like when I was a PhD student, like when you're starting out, you don't know what's good and you don't know what's bad. And so you're just reading through everything and you don't know what's going to be relevant to your research and what's irrelevant. So you just have to go through and read everything until you figure it out, which is a hard process for any student that's listening, struggling. Like you're normal if you're struggling with this, because this is just the experience of being a student. And so I'm reading through all sorts of stuff that I'm like, maybe this is profound because everybody thinks this guy's like really brilliant, and then he's going on about how like he has a post metaphysical judicial ontology with the ethical, and it's a starogrammer centric of death, that like the death of the other is the death of the other, and I'm like, does any of that mean anything at all? And the answer is no. It's all meaningless jargon, but it sounds so cool, and so I had to spend way too long before I realized vast portions of theology was being written is just meaningless jargon, and they're not just saying things that are possibly true or false. Give you one more example of this. So I taught at the University of Cambridge about 10 years ago, and I was asked to present for the Philosophy of Religion seminar. And my mentor, he wanted me to present on simplicity, and I'm like, I don't have anything new to say on the topic. And he's like, hey, it'll be fun. And the reason he wanted me to do it was because this was the statement that people made. You made truth claims. You said things that are possibly true or false. And that's why everyone in the room was so animated, because we're not used to that. So like I give a 30-minute presentation and then there's an hour and a half of just like discussion. It's just like everybody's like really intense because I said things that are possibly true or false. Whereas in a lot of theology, people just throw around adjectives like crazy. They just make an adjective salad. And you're like, nobody knows what's being said, including the speaker. And Q&A is kind of boring. Whereas I'm like, yeah, God's not like this. He's like this. And this is what's true and this is what's false. I don't even give an argument. People are just like, whoa, what is this guy doing? He's nuts. He's like actually saying things that are possibly true or false. Like it's unheard of, you know? So this is a very common problem, I think, in theology. So yeah, I bang my head a lot in frustration.
Wow. And sometimes this, like there is merit to this discipline, but then sometimes there is also things where, it just becomes practically useless at times, where you're just arguing for this particular person's this view, he said that, and then there's no actually something that is well being constructed that is actually meaningful. Do you agree that sometimes that becomes useless?
Yeah, I try to be charitable as I can and go, there might be something I don't understand, this particular debate or this question that certain people are looking at. And I'll go, there probably is something interesting or of merit there. It's just beyond me because I've not, studied it. And then other times when I have studied it, I'll just go, no, I know there's nothing. That's me. That's stupid. Like, but that's because I've gone through this process of trying to learn what's like good and what's bad theology. But yeah, there are a lot of times where I look at some discussions and I'm like, that actually is a waste of time. And if I'm living in a country where taxpayer money is going towards it, in America, like taxpayer money is not really going towards much of anything that's useful. But in other countries like Finland, they funded my book. And I'm like, I think that's useful. But other people are going, God and time? That's stupid. That's useless. Like who would, I'm like, okay. So people's opinions vary on how useful they think these things are.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. So yeah, of course, there's a debate. So one thing that still comes to my mind is I feel that many aspects of theology are not for the layman. Would you agree that okay, yeah, some aspects of theology, just the layman, it's better if they don't get into this. They might get more confused if they do.
Maybe it's because I am American. Like I just have this this impulse to be like, no, democratize it for everyone, make it available to everyone. I don't know how realistic that is, though. I think that's very idealistic on my end of going, let's try to make this as easy to understand for everyone as I possibly can. But there are a lot of people that I meet who love the fact that I can explain these things really easily. It really helps them with their faith. But there are others who they just can't handle big questions. It's too scary, or they don't like being wrong. And when you're doing philosophy, everyone disagrees with you, so like everyone thinks you're wrong. And so like some people can't handle that. So
Right.
yeah, so not everybody's dispositions really are best fitted for going really deep in theology. But because I've got this idealistic American attitude of like, yeah, just make it for everyone. I try.
Yeah, I think I had a brilliant discussion with you. I got so many gems to learn from, and I'm pretty sure that our audience also got so many things to learn from. I've never seen a video where like so many of your gems that are compact in one video. So I think my audience are going to really enjoy this. Of course, like what you have to provide is something very valuable to many different communities. I believe we should cherish that. And with that note, I think any closing statement that you have for us, maybe, and then we can end the discussion.
Yeah, no, this has been a really good discussion. If anybody's looking to go deeper, like you can go to my website, rtmullins.com. All the stuff that has been shown up on the screen is there. My podcast is there. Also, I am the master coordinator and a lecturer for the University of Lucerne. So we have an online master's program in philosophy, theology, and religions, where we start with ancient Greece and we work our way through, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all the way to like modern contemporary debates. So it's a very robust program. So if people are wanting to study with me, come talk to me. I can show you more about the program.
Okay. On that note, I look forward to maybe have more opportunities to speak to you again, maybe next year sometime.